Sarah checked her phone again. 12:47 a.m. The last train had already left, and her usual bus route had stopped running an hour ago. She sighed and pulled her coat tighter around herself, the autumn chill creeping through the fabric. The streets were nearly empty, the occasional flickering neon sign casting eerie glows onto the damp pavement. She had stayed too late at her friend's apartment, lost in conversation, and now she was paying for it. Then, she saw it. An old bus pulling up at the corner. It was an unfamiliar route. Route 13, final destination. Sarah hesitated. That was an odd name for a route, but the thought of waiting another hour in the cold made the decision for her. She jogged to the curb just as the doors hissed open. The driver sat stiffly in his seat, his uniform crisp but somehow aged. His cap was pulled low, casting shadows over his hollow, sunken eyes. He didn't greet her. He only gave a slow nod before shifting his gaze back to the road. Sarah climbed aboard, the doors sealing shut behind her with a heavy finality. She moved down the aisle, scanning for an open seat. The bus was nearly full, yet it was silent. No murmured conversations, no rustling of coats or shifting of feet. The passengers sat in eerie stillness, their faces blank and pale. Sarah slid into an empty seat near the back, suddenly uneasy. The air was stale, thick with an odd metallic scent, like old coins left in the rain. She glanced at the man across from her. He wore a stiff, outdated suit, hands folded neatly in his lap. His skin had a waxy sheen, and his eyes, glassy and unfocused, staring straight ahead. Her stomach twisted. Was he asleep? Sarah looked around. No one blinked. No one moved. Something was wrong. The engine's hum was the only sound, deep and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. The city lights outside blurred past, but they looked off. The streets seemed to stretch longer than they should. Buildings flickered, distorted, as though seen through warped glass. She swallowed hard. This was just a late-night bus. People were tired. Maybe they had long shifts. Maybe they were just deep in thought. Maybe. Sarah shook off her unease and tapped the stop request button. It let out a dull click, but no light came on. She frowned. Maybe it was broken. She rose from her seat and moved toward the driver. "Excuse me, I need to get off at the next stop." The driver didn't turn his head. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles bloodless. "There are no stops," he said. His voice was dry, brittle, like leaves crushed underfoot. Sarah's skin crawled. "What? That doesn't make sense." The driver's grip tightened. "There are no stops on this route." A cold dread settled into her bones. "Then where does it go?" she asked, voice unsteady. The driver's lips barely moved. "To the end." Sarah turned and hurried back to her seat, her pulse hammering in her ears. Outside the window, the city had vanished. There were no more streets, no more buildings, just an endless black expanse, stretching forever. Her breath hitched. This wasn't possible. She had just seen streetlights, traffic signals, normal things. But now, outside was nothing. She turned to the nearest passenger, an old woman in a heavy coat. "Ma'am," Sarah whispered, shaking the woman's shoulder. The woman's head tilted, too far. Her neck bent at an impossible angle, revealing a hollow darkness where her eyes should have been. Sarah let out a strangled gasp and stumbled back. The other passengers began to move, not naturally, jerky, unnatural twitches, like puppets being pulled by invisible strings. Their heads turned toward her, their blank eyes now wide, staring through her. A chorus of whispered voices filled the air, overlapping, layering over one another. "You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be here." Sarah backed away, heart pounding. "Let me off!" she screamed at the driver. He did not turn. The bus began to descend. The blackness outside shifted, revealing a landscape of twisted, screaming faces embedded in the ground, their mouths open in silent agony. Sarah clawed at the door, but it didn't budge. The driver finally spoke, his voice like wind through dead trees. "You were never meant to leave." Memories slammed into her, flashes of another night, another bus ride, She had taken this route before. She had never gotten off. She wasn't alive. Sarah turned back. The passengers were now smiling. Their lips curled into impossibly wide grins, their teeth stretching too long. And she remembered. She was one of them. The midnight bus was not for the living. The bus plunged into the abyss. Sarah screamed, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw was her reflection in the window, her face becoming hollow, her eyes turning black. Then, silence. The midnight bus continued its journey, forever collecting lost souls, and somewhere, in another city, at another midnight, it would pull up to the curb once again, waiting for its next passenger. The bus rumbled through the endless black void. It had been moving for centuries, or maybe seconds. Time no longer had meaning. Sarah sat motionless, just like the others, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was aware, for now. But she could feel herself fading, her thoughts growing distant, her memories unraveling like old thread. Her name was Sarah, wasn't it? Something jolted her back, something new. The bus was stopping. It never stopped. Sarah's hollow gaze flicked to the door as it opened with a hiss. A gust of cold air rushed in. A young man stepped aboard. He was in his 20s, alive, breathing, unaware. His hoodie was damp from the mist outside, and he was busy typing on his phone. He didn't look up as he fished for a few coins and dropped them into the fare box. Clink. The sound echoed unnaturally, swallowed by the dead silence. The driver, with his gaunt face and hollow eyes, gave a slow nod. The doors sealed shut behind the new passenger. Sarah wanted to scream. "Get out! Run! Don't sit down! Don't look at us! Don't—" But she couldn't move. Her lips wouldn't part. Her body wouldn't obey. The man, Ethan, she heard the name echo in her mind, walked down the aisle and took a seat, right next to her. A new soul, a new prisoner. Ethan exhaled, still tapping on his phone. Sarah turned her head an inch. It took everything, every shred of her remaining will. She glanced at the window. Reflections. The passengers' faces should have been there, but they weren't. Only Ethan's face stared back at him, his and something else. A shadow, not hers, not anyone's. Something behind him. A flicker of motion, a grin too wide. Sarah's fingers twitched. She had to move, had to stop this, had to— A sound rippled through the bus. A whisper. It wasn't coming from Ethan, or from the driver. It was coming from the passengers. He doesn't know. He doesn't see. He doesn't know. He doesn't see. The murmuring slithered through the air like dead leaves scraping pavement. Sarah felt Ethan stiffen beside her. He heard it. His hands froze over his phone. Slowly, he turned his head toward Sarah. "Hey," he whispered. "Did you—" His voice died in his throat. Sarah wasn't sure what he saw on her face, but whatever it was, it made him go pale. He looked around now, really looked, and he realized. Ethan's breath quickened. "What the hell?" He reached for the stop request button. He pressed it. Again. Again. No light. No sound. Sarah wanted to tell him it wouldn't work. That it never worked. The driver's grip tightened on the wheel. "There are no stops on this route," he said. Ethan lurched from his seat. He bolted down the aisle, trying to pry the doors open. They didn't budge. He turned to the driver. "Let me off." Silence. Then, "There is no off." Sarah could feel it happening. The pull. Her awareness was slipping again, sinking into the same blank, hollow existence as the others. Soon, she would forget again. Unless— She fought against it. Fought with everything she had left. She turned to Ethan and moved. It was a slow, unnatural motion, like forcing a corpse to rise. But she did it. She spoke. "There's a way out." Ethan spun toward her. "What did you say?" Sarah's voice was dry, barely a whisper. "The window." Ethan followed her gaze. The glass reflected something impossible. A different place. Not the endless void outside, but A city street. A different time. Ethan's eyes widened. "What the hell is that?" Sarah's voice cracked. "Break it." The driver's hands twitched. The passenger's heads snapped toward them, a ripple of movement. They were rising. Ethan hesitated only a second. Then he grabbed the metal pole near the seat and swung it. Glass shattered. The bus lurched violently. A howling wind ripped through the space. The passengers screamed, but not in pain, in rage. Sarah grabbed Ethan's wrist. "Jump!" Ethan and Sarah dived through the broken glass. Darkness swallowed them, falling, then impact. Sarah gasped as cold air flooded her lungs. She was on the ground, a street. The neon glow of a 24-hour diner blinked nearby. A taxi rumbled past. Ethan groaned beside her, clutching his arm. They were back. The bus was gone. No screeching tires. No doors closing. Just empty space where it had been. Sarah turned to Ethan, chest heaving. "You saw it," she whispered. Ethan nodded, his face pale. What the hell was that? Sarah looked down at her hands. They were hers again. Warm, human. But something wasn't right. Because when she looked at her reflection in the diner window, for just a split second, she saw the driver's face, watching her, smiling. The midnight bus was still out there, and it was still waiting for the next passenger. The end?